Good morning to everybody. This is Stefano, Mazarin Geopolitics from Italy. Today we are honored to have one Russian guest in our channel. A little presentation about him. Anatoly Karlin is a Russian repatriate, a blogger and intelligence researcher. His primary blog is Powerful Takes at Substack. Where he write about Russia, geopolitics, and other interesting things. All the links are in the description. Please subscribe. He has also Twitter, Discord, a lot of other channels. So Telegram. Please subscribe to him and let us know everything that you want to ask to him during his speech. I will collect the questions about Anatoly during the next 15-20 minutes. And if you are curious about anything, just use the chat of YouTube and I will collect the question. Anatoly, the stand is yours. Tell us your point about the geopolitical situation and just to understand, as we said in advance, a little bit of Russian mindset.
Okay, certainly, yes, that's my pleasure. Thanks for having me on the show. The most obvious topic is, of course, the Ukraine war. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about it because I think it might get boring pretty quickly. And in any case, I think it would be more interesting just to have a dialogue with the audience and answer questions in more depth. But basically, speaking of the Ukraine war, my thesis at the outset, which I posted in my article on this, The Gathering of the Russian Lands, in which I said that the war is almost certainly going to happen. I said that Russia had Russia's logic, what I believed to be its logic, was firstly geopolitical timing. So Ukrainian military was modernizing at a relatively rapid clip, as we subsequently saw, and so the window of opportunity to do anything was fading. Whereas the Minsk Accords, which had been established, which was they were never adopted. And in any case, by 2019, it was clear that by 2021, it was clear that they were not going to be fulfilled. Pro-Russian political parties were getting banned. Media was getting pro-Russian media in Ukraine was getting banned. And at the same time, Ukrainian military stand was rising. So why did Russia not do this earlier? Well, probably because the economy wasn't ready. You had to sanctions-proof it. And another consideration, I believe, which might have been, which it doesn't really get talked about much, even to this day, is that the mid to 2010s were dominated by Chimerica, so-called Chimerica, the Chinese-American economic relationship, which, however, since the Trump era has been breaking down at an accelerating clip. Because of various disputes around economics, Taiwan, and so forth. So most recently, now translating into technological sanctions. And basically, you can't really take on a bloc whose GDP outnumbers you by a factor by an order more than order of magnitude. So Russia's GDP is like 2 trillion in nominal terms, 4 trillion in purchasing power parity terms. The combined GDP of the US and its allies, more like close to 50 trillion. So not really comparable. So if Russia was going to do this, it would logically lead to very severe breakdown in economic relations, and for that it would need support from some degree of support from China. which, I mean, to be fair, it sort of worked out. I mean, one interesting observation about this entire conflict is that, as an Indian acquaintance of mine noted, an alien observer looking at it from space could plausibly say that this is some kind of race war, essentially, with the whites on Ukraine side, with the exception of the Serbs, and the non-whites either don't care or sympathize with Russia, although logically the dominant attitude is one of its difference, just seeing this as this basically internal affair amongst Europeans, essentially. But yeah, I mean, to that extent, that one thing has worked out with Russia now sourcing its semiconductors overwhelmingly from China, India buying its oil, and so forth. But obviously, there was a huge underestimation about Russia's own military strength, and I mean, I underestimated the military component because, well, I mean, first of all, if knowing what we know now, I think it's highly unlikely that the Kremlins would have pursued the invasion. But they basically drastically overestimated Russia's real military strength, underestimated Ukrainian military strength, underestimated the extent to which the West would provide support. Although critically, that only came once it became clear that the initial invasion had gotten bogged down, and also just simply really big and bizarre mistakes early on with respect to just the military. Just the military conduct of the war, which basically no World War II general would have committed. So you invaded with far too few troops, like 200,000, down about 250,000, whereas you needed at least 500 million in the early stages. And then once it became clear that there was a treatment of the Ukrainian army with something like resembling, I mean, I'm not even talking about not bombing like the electricity grid and so forth at the very beginning, as the Americans do at the beginning of their military campaigns. I mean, just there were even the Ukrainian army barracks went stuck in the first hours and days of the conflict, which is certainly a very bizarre way to wage war. And then once the failure of the initial campaign became clear, and it also became clear that you'd need a lot more troops to actually accomplish the putative goals that Russia appeared to have set itself in Ukraine, which seems to have been the conquest and annexation of the territories of Novorossiya, the 8 oblasts in eastern and southern Ukraine that constituted the historical Novorossiya. Once the failure of that became clear, you obviously needed to do mobilization. Well, I mean, from April essentially, but they only came down to that in September, once the front line began to collapse in around Kharkov, simply due to lack of organization and critically due to undermanning. And the other really big failure, obviously, is the pretty bizarre lack of attention to surging military production. So, I mean, one kind of thing that I've been harping on about, which I had assumed that they do, but which wasn't done, was to drastically increase military spending. Because again, if you have tens of billions of dollars pouring in Western aid and arms supplies, like basically Ukraine is spending like the equivalent of more than 50% of its GDP, like not only from its own sources but mainly as direct transfers from NATO countries, then you'd obviously need to like spend a lot more on the military than the 5% of no more than 5% of GDP that Russia has been spending to date. because again you need to provision the army with not just like with modern armor, a lot of which has been destroyed over the past half year, but with modern communication systems and so forth. Where there's big problems, but in practice you've had a lot of really bad organization and basically a delegation of responsibility of doing this to the regions, which again is very bizarre because I mean it's the federal government in Russia that actually has the means to equip and make sure those units are all equipped, whereas the fiscal capacity of Russian regions is highly variable. I mean, Moscow, Tatarstan, like places like that can equip their troops pretty well. But if you're speaking of, I don't know, like Bryansk Oblast, then that's, I mean, where are they going to get the money for it from? Yeah, I mean, I can go on about the various mistakes and just the organizational kerfuffles around this. I mean, there's some good developments. There seems to be a realization of late that there needs to be a lot more spending if Russia is to actually accomplish anything in Ukraine, or at the bare minimum just hold what it currently has, because yeah, I mean, so I mean, it seems to be doing the bare minimum in my opinion to just freeze the front lines where they are. Basically, Ukrainian capabilities, despite Western aid and their sort of like better organizational structure and better morale, it shouldn't be overestimated, because ultimately the areas, the two cases in which they've had large offensive successes, Kharkov was when they had a big local quantitative advantage. And in Kherson, Russia just retreated to a more defensible line. Like achieving success in large-scale combined arms operations against forces that match them quantitatively is something that Ukraine has yet to demonstrate it has the capacity to do. So I would say that is the main bullish factor going for Russia at the moment. Not any innate Russian strength, but simply that the Ukrainians don't appear to be supermen of any kinds. And basically the war right now seems to just be basically one of attrition, in which no side can probably expect to make very large gains, like in one direction or the other. So that's sort of like my baseline scenario for the next year or two, just continuing attrition, especially over like probably Russia will make some more modest advances in Donbass, take Bakhmut, probably eventually. Although I don't really think it's far less likely that the Slavyansk-Kramatorsk line will ever be broken, and Ukraine might make some. Conversely, might make some advances in Zaporozhye and in around Svatovo, but I don't really expect to see like really large scale breakthroughs, given that like the modern of nature war seems to have been one in which you have all these drones and surveillance assets. So it's actually relatively easy to see concentrations of enemy concentrations like quite far in advance. So the battlefield is significantly more visible than it was in World War II. And to achieve breakthroughs, the classical principle is that you have to achieve concentrations, local concentrations of mass, which sort of like predominate, achieve like quantitative superiority on sectors of the front to achieve breakthroughs. And that kind of thing is just a lot more difficult these days, like due to the changing nature of war, essentially. So in combination with all of these factors, with Russian mobilization, there'll probably be another wave that in January or February, I assume. So Russia was outnumbered in Ukraine in terms of manpower for like in the previous months. Now that factor is moot. On the other hand, a lot of Russia's military hardware was attritioned over ever since February, and it remains to be seen whether Russia will actually launch a war economy. I mean, if Russia increases military spending from 5% of GDP to 15% or more, and actually starts producing like thousands of T-90s or like or well, I mean, I'm not talking of Armatas, but yeah, like starts producing hundreds of T-90s and actually makes sure that that modern communications are distributed and that troops are well trained. I mean, not just spend 2 or 3 months in a training camp with occasional visits to the firing range. I mean, that's not really serious. If Russia is going to do that, then yeah, you like the resumption of like real Russian offensives into Ukraine is realistic. But without that happening, it's not. Any talk of successful offensive from Kiev or even further west from the direction of Belarus are just the fever dreams from Bureaucrats, in my opinion, right now. So very skeptical about Russia's capacity to achieve offensive successes in the current situation, but also pretty skeptical about Ukraine's as well. And I don't think that's sort of like some kind of French analysis. I mean, I think that's basically Kaufman's, Rably's position right now, the most successful analysts. And Strelkov has also had a very good predictive record. And he's like famous. He's like very critical of the Russian war effort right now. But he's still agnostic on whether Ukraine can indeed significantly advance past the current front lines. So yeah, that's sort of my prediction. Probably a year or two more of additional warfare with no major changes in the front lines, and then some kind of mutual exhaustion and negotiations. So yeah, I mean, that's basically my outlook at the moment. But perhaps the audience will be more interested in other questions. So I think we might as well move on to the part about the questions now.
Okay, perfect. No, the interpretation was very interesting. I have also my question, what I'm collecting from the public. Let me give it to you. Okay, the first one is from Felipe Pires from Brazil, which is your fan number 1 in the world. Mm-hmm. So, are you seeing any application of artificial intelligence being deployed on the battlefield? Can you list any examples?
Artificial intelligence on the battlefield.
Yes.
Okay, well, I think it's something that the Ukrainians do mostly through US systems. There's like the Guardian had an article about this quite recently, in which they talked about it. Weapons are computers, Ukrainian coders aim to gain a battlefield edge. But I think right now it's mainly about just not so much AI, but using like data collection on a really massive scale to identify concentrations of enemy units. And I think the real potential probably lies in the future. So we've already seen that the drones are very effective in this war. So just like dropping from like banal stuff like dropping grenades on trenches to the bigger drones like the Shaheds, which they should use at the beginning, although it seems to have sort of died down. Probably another very strange thing, and again, failure of Russian sort of industrial strategy. Why aren't there more Shaheds? I mean, they're basically flying lawnmowers. They're not difficult to manufacture. They're like $25,000 per unit. But yeah, that aside, and the Ukrainians have started using drones. But it's still at a very simple level. You where you select a target and like some GPS coordinates and send a drone over towards that area. But if you could start using AI to give them swarm intelligence, then that would basically multiply their effectiveness many times over. I think the real potential of all this sooner lies in the future, and now to the extent that this is happening right now, it's more like in the testing phases, like say fighter planes in the first year of World War One. Perhaps one could use that example.
If I can connect to this question, because it's interesting to understand your point of view. It's also like from Felipe Pires also. Is Russian military industrial output managed to overmatch the West?
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, I'd assumed that there would have been a major effort to modernize the military-industrial complex and to obviously to make it more independent of dependence on Western technological chains. Because obviously, if you're going to get into a war and this war ends up not like succeeding in the first month or two, and instead dragging out into many months and potentially several years, then you'd obviously need to do all of that because over time Western publics get more radicalized. These technological links, like this progressive sanctions. So eventually you have to come up with your own solutions, right? But unfortunately, I mean, in that aspect, it seems that a lot of this process was to a significant extent fictive or just hampered by corruption, like people setting up front companies and saying that they're indigenous Russian, but actually like set up in the Czech Republic and just continuing to source Western components like to these front companies instead of actually recreating this stuff within Russia. And the extent of this does seem to have sort of surprised me in a negative direction. The good thing is that a lot of military tech isn't like super complicated. Like for instance, you need like really modern like semiconductors if you want to have small to put into your cell phone because your cell phone needs to be small. But if you're producing a caliber missile, whatever, military electronics, I mean, they tend to be pretty bulky anyway. And I mean, just by themselves, I mean, there's it's not such a critical weight isn't such a critical consideration for military platforms, especially if you also bear in mind that a lot of these electronics have to be hardened anyway, which adds more mass. So that's sort of like the encouraging thing is like some of this stuff that she can source itself. It does do some small scale semiconductor manufacturing, so micron. And a lot of the other stuff it needs, it can source from China. Basically, Russian imports of semiconductors now dominated by China.
Let me connect to this final your answer. It's two questions that are interesting. One military, still from Brazil. Like I will put you two questions. Is China going to military help Russia eventually? And this is I collected in advance. That is. Let's say, in your opinion, is Russia not at risk to becoming a vassal of China in a post-war scenario? In a case that I probably, let's say, make it more clear the question. In my opinion, when the war will end, probably the relationship between Europe and Russia will return not at the same level of before, but for sure one sort of trading and whatever will start. But if this type of trade will be cut completely and Russia must sell east instead of west, could be China a little bit let's say, bigger than Russia is expecting to manage as a partner.
Mm-hmm. I mean, there is obviously some element of that, and the Russian state flows are indeed the orienting towards the east. So trade with China has increased by something like 40% this year. With India, I think it's tripled actually, if I remember correctly. Whereas with the West, it's obviously like plummeted. But to the extent to which China can exercise dominance over Russia, I do think is significantly limited. I've said this from the start, like regardless of what happens, simply on account of several factors. The world might not be the West, but it's not just the West and China either. There's also India, which is becoming a progressively important player. There's Southeast Asia, the Middle East. I mean, China is still obviously the most important partner because it's got the only like self-sustained, complex, advanced technological chain outside ecosystem, outside the sort of the Western sphere. So it's but still it doesn't have a like monopoly on as a partner outside the West. The second reason is that Chinese soft power is still quite limited. So I mean, like their propaganda isn't anywhere near as good as American propaganda, and I mean a lot of this is soft power. I mean, why is it? There was Alexei Pushkov, who's a Russian parliamentarian, who observed that Russia gave Ukraine $200 billion worth of gas discounts, and they like summing it up from the 1990s to the 2010s, and the US invested $5 billion in NGOs who sort of like spread their message, plus like America's general winner status in the Cold War. And this 5 billion turned out more important than the 200 billion. Again, if China doesn't have this kind of influence, which I mean, in terms of soft power, the Western culture, American culture especially, still remains a lot more omnipresent in Russia than Chinese, which is pretty minimal. Like even at the basic level, very few people know the Chinese language. So I mean, where is that going to come from? The third point I'd like to make is that even if you look at like China finds it's difficult to truly vassalize countries because like even if you look at some extreme example like North Korea, which has like 7 times fewer people than Russia and like probably like 50 times lower GDP, but still they like Kim Jong-un was apparently executed his uncle. That was apparently because he'd been getting too close to China. So yeah, I mean, China can't really even be said to have vassalized North Korea, let alone Russia. And I mean, if you look at Iran, which has more sanctions against it for 30 years than Russia, it's which has a twice lower population and 4 times lower GDP than Russia. But still, I mean, it's not vassalized to anyone. It's sort of like continues as its own sort of like it does have its GDP. Iran's GDP is obviously significantly lower by 20 or 25% than it would have been without Western sanctions, which American sanctions, which much of the rest of the world is obliged to follow simply by dint of America's world financial dominance. But even so, Iran, in economic terms, is pretty livable. Produces something like 1 million vehicles per year, which isn't bad given the situation. Even like supplies drones to Russia, which is not a technological relationship I think that anybody was expecting a year ago. So I don't really see Russia's sort of economic prospects as being catastrophic in the scenario of isolation from the West. And I also don't see it as being conducive to anything resembling vassalization by China, even though obviously over the medium term, Chinese influence, economic influence, for that matter, is going to increase.
Sorry, my mic. The other question was if, in your opinion, Russia can, let's say, help military. China could help military Russia in somehow.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, I was expecting China to be more forthright about this, because I suspect that that it answers to China's interests for a number of reasons. First of all, assuming that that the thing about retaking Taiwan isn't a lob to like deflect attention from domestic issues, but is actually a firmly held conviction of the Chinese leadership. Then it would make sense. Then, if China was to supply military hardware to Russia on a large scale, it would allow it to build up its own military industries in a way that's sort of deniable, in the sense that it's not something that's obviously aimed at a build-up towards declaiming Taiwan, but which can be, well, just done and later used to that effect. That's the first thing. The second thing is that my assumption was that, as I said, Russia needs a more hardware. I mean, it also needs more men, which it's
Manpower.
by manpower, yeah, which it's doing by belatedly starting mobilizations from September. But it also needs to increase military production. But if it's not going to do that, at least on a large scale, then the only obvious alternative to that, again, if it still seriously and has any designs on Novorossiya, then it needs to source this from China. Like, imagine Type 95 tanks, well, I mean, then probably about the same as equivalent to T90s. So if China was going to do this on a large scale, I mean, if China was going to do this on a scale like Iran is even doing, then that would materially change the balance of power to a very large extent. Because I said, yeah, I mean, like balancing things up, Russia spending something like 100 billion on the military right now, out of a GDP of 2 trillion, so 5%, like 5% of GDP. Ukraine is spending 20% of GDP, which is 200 billion. So that's around 40 billion of its own money. But then add the Western supplies, which is like 60, 70, 80, whatever billion. So also 100 billion was mostly decided by spending. I mean, The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers by Paul Kennedy, which is like a survey of all the great power wars that have been fought, came to the conclusion that it's almost inevitably the country or the coalition with the great economic potential, as translated into military capacity, that ends up winning wars. And basically, if you look at Russia versus Ukraine, then in terms of spending or military spending, which obviously translates into like soldiers, tanks, drones, shells, and so forth. It's basically equal. And the way to sort of like break that equality on Russia's part is to either massively increase its own spending, but that would require reformatting its economy and ultimately its society and political system in a very dramatic way that I'm not sure that the Putinist system is functionally capable of. Or if China was to start supplying Russia at a NATO level, like what's the US well, they're supplying like 50 billion, 70 billion. If China was to supply military aid at that kind of level, then that would bump Russia up to a significant predominance. And if Russia, just to complete my thought, and if is China interested in this? Well, I mean, yes, obviously it carries the risks of sanctions being strengthened against China, and perhaps it's not entirely ready for it. But I think that the U.S., I mean, there's three arguments against that, like simply not like moral or ethical arguments, but just like purely geopolitical arguments. Firstly, I think that the US-Chinese conflict is set in stone anyway. It's not going to happen. The technological noose is going to be drawn tighter, whatever happens. The second point is, as I said, is that provisioning Russia with military aid on large scale allows a deniable military buildup that can then be diverted towards solving China's security issues in the around Taiwan and the South China Sea. The third factor is that if the sense in a stalemate and a weaker Russia, then and a Russian sort of a post-war regime, either with Putin or without him, that is much more dependent on China, then it could conceivably work out better for China with a more dependent Russia on it than a Russia that achieves its goals in Ukraine, like unites with Belarus as well, probably. And becomes stronger. But on the other hand, there's also a significant chance of a truly catastrophic outcome in which Russia is defeated outright, and there's a color revolution afterwards in Russia, which I believe is almost certain in the event of a catastrophic defeat, and in which case that sort of post-regime change, Russia can might become part of the Western alliance space, and in that case, China's prospects for challenging American hegemony in this first part of the century are truly screwed, because well, I mean, then who else do they have? North Korea, Pakistan, maybe Iran. Very speculative. They're sort of like having troubles of their own in terms of political stability. So yeah, those are the three reasons for why I think, admittedly self-interested on Russia's part, for why China, it would probably be in China's best interests to start supplying Russia on a much larger scale. But obviously, it's ultimately for China to decide whether that happens.
Anatoly, if I can, make an add to your answer, because my point of view is that economically for China, it's very dangerous to be out of a neutral position, because Russia is an important partner for China, but it's, I don't know, the 8th or the 9th partner economically in the trade balance. Like if you take South Korea, US, and Europe, it's more than 60% of the export of China. So probably, like, if there is any type of sanction on China, it will be disaster for the internal economy of China. But it's based on export of commodities. And for the same thing, if I can put this question in advance, and then I have the others, like if we can discuss about a little bit about my first issue about the Russian economy, because the problem that it actually official data of Bank of Russia, Russia is actually in a recession between minus 3.4 to minus 4.5. And the forecast for 2023 is between minus 2.4 and between minus 5.6. With the official data of Bank of Russia, IMF, blah blah blah. If the Russian, let's say, historically economy is based on the export of oil and gas, and 80% of this oil and gas, it's normally and easily trade with Europe, not with the West, with Europe, because US it's importing very few materials from Russia because there is a trade, but not so much. And let's say that like this is like the pipeline, the pipeline to Europe. Actually, for example, I'm from Italy, and we are not importing at the moment from Russia, not because Russia is cutting off, but because we are not buying. We are buying from Algeria, Israel, Azerbaijan, whatever, GNL. What could be the alternative for Russia if there is, like, let's say, one cut of this export to Europe? Because, like, if we check, like, this is the alternative for Italy, because we have like pipeline to Africa, pipeline to Azerbaijan, and whatever, and actually the plus GNL. But the problem, if I can show to you, is that if Russia want to export to China, the first problem is that China is not growing now, so they cannot import more, because if they're not growing, they can import the same amount. And China and India are importing from Russia, but with a huge discount of $40 for cubic meters. So everybody, in my opinion, they are making their own business. Like China and India are buying from Russia, but because they can have a personal gain. So what could be in the short mid-term, in your opinion, the economical scenario if the war will not end? Because it will be a huge cut of the income of Russian oil and gas export.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, Russia has deserves to survive fiscally for several years with low oil and gas incomes, and at the end of the day, it could start reducing civilian state spending. Although obviously that carries its own risks to political stability over a prolonged period, and but again, this is something that's not a short medium term problem, but a long term one, especially since it's also likely that there's going to be some kind of global recession quite soon. That seems to be a relatively likely scenario right now. In which case, the gains from hydrocarbons, these also exports will decline even further due to demand, like lower demand. As regards China, it's growing more slowly. On the other hand, it's opening up after COVID, so growth there might actually resume. Plus, the dominant consideration in any case would be the extent to which they like not to which like additional demand grows, but also the extent to which they reorientate their sources. So, for instance, if the West starts buying more from the Middle East and from Azerbaijan, for instance, actually, to lessen the connection with Russia, then there'll just be natural compensation in the sense that like more of the Chinese demand would then be filled by Russian supplies. So in that sense, I don't see that as a huge issue, though. Yes, and in the medium to long term, the collapse of the sharp decline in oil export revenues, because they're actually much bigger than natural gas export revenues, is going to be very significant, and is also going to materially sort of like make it actually quite difficult to increase military spending, simply because then it would cut into consumer welfare to an even greater extent. So
in your opinion,
yeah,
like
so yeah, I mean, yeah, with like Italy's experience in World War II, right, where military spending like went to 18-20% and then just stayed there simply because the economy GDP peaked around 1941 and then just started like stayed there and then started going down. So yeah, in this condition, it's hard to sort of like power through any further increases in spending. So yeah. Sorry, what did you say?
No. I was asking if, in your opinion, it will be filled by the, let's say, regular Russian people, because my impression is that, let's say, especially like in Moscow and Peter, the people is not feeling the effect of the war. Let's say, actually today, let's say, if let's say there will be a big degradation of the economy by the cause of the declining of the, let's say, gain from the oil and gas export to the West. Because we can compensate with China and India, but with lower price and the lower profit. So it will be less gain, however. Do you think that the level, the expectation of the level of life of Russian people could be declined a little bit or not?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I mean, obviously, the effect on the economy was buffered to a very great extent, simply because oil prices remained high and actually offset direct losses. But this factor is going to start like fading away, especially if the world does enter a recession in which the demand goes down. And another way, I would actually say, I would add that in which the war was done, is that the Kremlins had this idea that the gas weapon could be used as a real weapon against Europe. Now, I was actually always skeptical from the beginning, and you can check my Twitter timeline for this, simply because Europeans are rich in global terms. If they have to like wear a sweater instead of like turning up the heater a bit more, then they'll do it, and it won't really make a difference. And if a few like destitute people freeze to death, like a few hundred, well, I mean, not a really serious issue.
Yeah, Anatoly,
but in the event, it seems that I mean, if you actually did want to maximize the impact of this, then you should have cut the gas immediately, so that they didn't have like an entire half a year to fill up the gas tanks, which are close to full in Germany, for instance. And but they didn't do that for whatever reason. So again, there's just a lot of things about the like Russia's grand strategy that I simply don't understand why things were done as they were done. Because I mean, the gas weapon is pretty much nullified. It was always at best only going to be good for one winter before alternatives were sourced. But it actually seems that it won't even be good for one winter.
Only to confirm, Anatoly, what you're saying. Let's say that I'm from Brescia, that it's in the north of Italy, that it's normally cold, and it's cold and humid. So it's less cold than in Russia, but it's humid, so you feel much more than in Russia. And but last year we were lucky because there was a lot of investment in Italy about like, let's say, energy saving, building, whatever. And outside there is, I don't know, 5 degrees, and my heating system is switched off because they remade all this year the building, and I don't need to switch on the heating system to have a warm inside. They change the window, blah blah blah. So I think that as you said, it was, let's say, more difficult to use this gas weapon as they thought. But a question that is connected to both parts: what could be a good deal for ending the war, or a peace treaty that could be acceptable by both parts, in your opinion? And especially for Russia, what could be a good exit strategy for Russia to keep facing the internal political scenario? Like, let's say, return back but sell it as a victory. If I
well, I mean, the problem is that it ultimately comes back to territorial goals, and it would be very hard for Russia to. I mean, the current state in which Russia has like the Donbass, well, half the Donbass, the main industrial parts of the Donbass, but which it had at the beginning anyway, and Crimea. The only sort of thing it really added, which was strategically like significant, was the Crimean corridor, in addition to the Crimean bridge, which obviously makes Crimea more defensible. It's a real sort of like achievement, but was it worth the economic cost? Well, I mean, obviously not. So I would sort of call this the current state of affairs to be a Pyrrhic victory for Russia, or maybe even a Pyrrhic stalemate. Not neither side is winning. But the thing is that Ukraine, the Kiev authorities obviously don't just want to reverse all Russia's gains since February 22nd, but they also maintain that, and they have consistently maintained since the very beginning, which is actually a credit to them, because that sort of raises morale to a great extent on the Kremlin strategy, which was never clearly enunciated. Russian soldiers don't really know what exactly they're fighting for. Is it just to regather the Russian lands for real, or is it just to buy time, or until there's some kind of peace treaty? But yeah, sorry, that's an aside. But yeah, I mean, Ukraine's demands are like Russia to vacate back to the 1991 borders. So leave Donbass and leave Crimea, and then discuss reparations. I mean, those are sort of like the Ukrainian demands on paper, which obviously would be, in the event of a prolonged stalemate, toned down and subject to negotiation and taxes. But the reality is that on paper, that's the stated Ukrainian goal, and furthermore, the Ukrainian nationalists do have a lot of say in what happens. There was an attempt to implement Minsk II, which was unsuccessful simply because it was eventually torpedoed by nationalist forces, who just openly threatened Zelensky and said that no, not even Crimea is negotiable, even though like multiple opinion polls, including Western ones, have shown that Crimeans overwhelmingly prefer being in Russia. And should Ukraine actually somehow manage to reacquire Crimea, it's just going to become this really economically desolated and depopulated place, simply because a lot of they say that 800,000 of the Russians who came there since 2014 will simply have to leave, plus a lot of other people will leave. Are they going to be spending a lot of money on this region whom they view as traitors? Well, presumably, probably highly unlikely. I mean, from a sort of like an objective position, which sort of like smarter people in Ukraine would recognize, is that Donbass, like Donetsk, Lugansk, Crimea, which have sort of like had separatist sentiments ever since the Ukrainian state achieved independence, would be more of a burden than anything else. That's sort of like something that's realized, but again, that's not something you admit in a war, and furthermore, it's not something that certainly nationalists who have a lot of influence would admit. Conversely, accepting even the current situation would be problematic for the Kremlins, simply because, well, like losing at least, probably my estimate, 35,000 dead, which is like the Chechen, like almost 2 Chechen wars in Afghanistan combined. That's a just in exchange for the Crimean corridor, and plus like economic isolation from the West on a large scale, was that worth it? I mean, objectively, just in exchange for the Crimean corridor, I mean, probably not. But I mean, it could be painted off as a victory. But if you lose the Crimean corridor, then that becomes really hard to justify as a victory, well, basically impossible. And furthermore, if you lose any more, if you like, if Ukraine actually does manage to go beyond the February 22nd borders, then I don't really see the Putin regime surviving for long after that happens. So yeah, I mean, that's the sort of like mutual expectations that both sides have seem to be incompatible, and sadly that probably just means that the war goes on for another 1 or 2 years until there's mutual exhaustion and war weariness and some deal. I mean, an equitable deal at this point, assuming like both sides have lost the capacity or will for further large mobilizations, escalations, and so on, would probably be something like Russia vacating the Crimean corridor, running referendums in Donbass and Crimea, which will almost certainly be won by votes in favor of joining Russia, and Russia like accepting that the $300 billion that were confiscated by the West from its foreign reserves just go to rebuilding Ukraine, because those $300 billion are almost certainly lost anyway. But that at least sort of like avoids the question of like reparations, which would be politically very unpopular and hard to accept for Russia domestically. So some kind of deal along these lines would probably be the most equitable arrangement. But whether that and if that is eventually the outcome or something along those lines, then it's pretty sad that the war will continue for another 1 or 2 years, just to sort of like make people realize that that is going to be the outcome anyway. But it is what it is.
Okay, let me put you the last two questions, like to close the stream. The first one, it's very geopolitical, so you can answer fastly, but it's it's about what do you think about the Heartland theory?
Well, I don't. I mean, it's pretty central to geopolitics.
I asked to you, Anatoly, only because Dugin and let's say Brzezinski were let's say pushing a lot on Heartland, especially on let's say Russia cannot be an empire without Ukraine. So this is why the question is asked.
I view geopolitical power in terms of GDP and populations and self-contained technological chains. I mean, that's by far the most important factor. I mean, having some geographic positions are more advantageous than others. Obviously, Germany's position in the center of Europe is not as good as, say, Britain's, which can sort of like has the channel to protect it and can interfere, can sort of like intervene at like has a lot of choice in where to intervene. But I mean, that's very much a secondary factor in the way I view the world. Now, Dugin has some really basically strange ideas, like how surfing is an expression of Atlanticism. I mean, he's like this guy who's a cosplayer, in my opinion, who like the that symbol of Eurasianism, that's like the symbol of chaos from Warhammer 40k. I mean, he's an interesting person as an artist, as an entertainer, I suppose, but a lot of his stuff just doesn't make sense, and like this, especially the anti-technological elements. I mean, the Russia's like really big problem is that it sort of didn't keep track of developments in like the cutting edge of military affairs. Didn't focus on drones or networking, which turned out to be extremely important. Networking all these assets together to provide a sort of like a comprehensive battlefield view to maximize the effectiveness with which you use the assets. And like if Russia was done along Duginist lines, all of this would just become 10 times worse. So I don't take Dugin seriously as an analyst, and in general, I think that he is relatively more prominent in the West, and for that matter, in Ukraine itself, than he is in Russia. I mean, it's worth bearing in mind that he was dismissed from Moscow State University in 2015 or 16. I mean, he's not like the super influential grey cards and all of the Kremlin that Western journalists seem to think he is. And tragically, the fact that there was an assassination attempt on him, which ended up killing his daughter instead, seems to have been born from this Western and Ukrainian viewpoint that Dugin actually is some sort of like really important ideological figure amongst the Kremlins. Whereas there's scant evidence that he is. Whereas Arestovich, who's a prominent figure in Ukraine, he was actually a disciple of Dugin, and there's another one, Shokhovtsev, who's an anti-extremism, who's branded himself as an anti-extremism researcher and sort of anti-Putinist campaigner, who was also his disciple. I think the head of the Crimean Eurasian Youth Fund or something like that, like a couple of decades ago. So there's a lot of ironies there, but it does seem that Dugin's influence is something that he also targets Western audiences a lot. So unlike Dutch nationalists like Kolmogorov or the late Igor Presvidnin, who like Sputnik and Pogrom. The one thing I think that Kamil Galiev is absolutely right about is that if there's sort of like a nationalist like pundit who influenced Russian as like Russian elites to a significant extent, it's probably Igor Presvidnin, Sputnik and Pogrom, that entire ecosystem, than Dugin, even though in the West Dugin is approximately 100 times as well known.
Anatoly, let me put you the last question just to close. This is like very interesting for me, but I will see you why. How do you interpret the presence of Russian minorities in almost all former Soviet republics as a justification, let's say, for future special military operation? Example, Abkhazia, South Ossetia, that already was in 2008, Baltic states, but also Moldova, Transnistria, whatever. Because you have huge minorities in every, let's say, also in Kazakhstan, northern Kazakhstan, it's mainly Russian. Do you think that these minorities, and also, let's say, the famous phrase of Putin that said that, let's say, the dissolution of the Soviet Union was the worst geopolitical disaster because the 20 millions of Russians, let's say, were outside Russia after the 25th of December of 1991. What do you think about it?
Well, I mean, I think it's pretty bizarre to worship Soviet era borders, which were essentially, imposed during the early Soviet period at great violence, and which often didn't reflect natural ethno-linguistic boundaries, and were basically done to for political reasons, essentially. The one thing I'd point out is that there's the examples. I think a part of Putin's ideology was that he has come down to the view that there's sort of like a natural East Slavic civilization state that's sort of like bounded by and descended from the period of medieval Russia, and that the Ukrainian identity are those in substantial part due to foreign influences, Austrian and Polish, and furthermore, after was very artificially inflected in a specifically anti-Russian direction after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Well, I think there's merits to all of those arguments. But the extent to which that can be extended to other places in the ex-USSR are very questionable, although obviously it sort of fits like the propaganda aims of people from those regions, in the sense that they want Russia to be sort of pushed back, as Russian influence to be pushed back as far as possible. I don't think Russia has any serious designs on Georgia, which is an entirely separate civilization, entirely separate people, like culturally, genetically, whatever. I mean, the Abkhazians don't want to be in Georgia, and the South Ossetians naturally want to be in one state with North Ossetians, which is natural, but that's not Russian ethnic any Russian identism per se. 1% of Georgian population is Russian or something like that. The Baltics, well, I mean, again, like the time to Russify them was like in the late. The time for that has passed. It's unrealistic, and they're NATO anyway. So again, totally besides the point. As for Moldova, well, I mean, Transnistrians. I mean, why should Transnistrians have to forcibly be within Europe's poorest country with like this extremely inchoate sense of national identity? I mean, probably the most logical long-term solution for Moldova, instead of keeping it in this weird limbo position, would just be for Moldova proper, Bessarabia, to rejoin Romania, for which there is significant support in both Romania and in Moldova proper, and for Transnistria to join Russia. That would seem to be, well, I mean, more equitable long term than keeping it bundled up together for just for the sake of respecting borders that don't really have any grounding in local ethno-linguistic realities.
Okay, perfect. So, Anatoly, thank you for your time. I hope that the people will like the stream. For all the people that didn't see the live, that it's normally the majority, please, if you have any type of questions for Anatoly, I will send to him, and we will like and be pleased to invite him for the geopolitical school in Italy in October. So if you have any questions, just put in the comments. And I send a little message. I have these two flags today. Okay, so I have both. So I hope for tomorrow that it's like for the Catholics Christmas. I say a Merry Christmas to everybody. I hope for all the people that the peace will return as fast as possible, especially for the people that it's directly involved during the war, because I know people from both parts, and it's a disaster, especially for the normal people. We are talking about geopolitics, but for the regular people that are without electricity or water, or with parents in the war, it's a disaster. So Merry Christmas to everybody. Thanks, Anatoly, for your speech. Wait one sec after I close. And for all the other viewers of Mazarin Geopolitics, we will have an open mic, I think, next week, and a lot of other streams in planning, but in January. So see you next stream, and thank Anatoly for your speech.
All right, thank you. It was very good to